Hey everyone, Panyo here. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of After Dinner Mints. I highly encourage everyone tuning in to join us in the Art Blocks Discord. A link to our Discord can be found in the show notes. Like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss an episode of our weekly show. And now I want to introduce our guest for today. We have generative artist Emily Weil. How's it going, Emily? How are you doing today?
Great. So nice to be here.
Well, I'm happy to have you on the show today. We're going to dig into your project Symbol One, which is on Art Blocks. But yeah, maybe before we kind of get started, I would love to learn a little bit more about your background.
So I have been doing digital art for years. I first came across this convergence of art and code when I was actually really lucky to have a fellowship from a company in California. I actually told this story on my pre-drop talk, but I'll tell it again because it's actually, it's the sort of inception of my interest in this kind of work. I had this fellowship and I was meant to experiment with technology. And I was working with live video streams, sort of webcams, streams from webcams, and looking for points of motion in video. And I remember I had gotten to a point which I thought was pretty good. And I was sharing an office with this guy. And I said, I'm going to go out and get some lunch. And by mistake, I actually left the algorithm running and went to the deli around the corner, got a sandwich, came back to the office and looked at my screen. And it was really quite surprising what I saw. And my office mate turned to me and he pointed and he said, that's art. And so that was pretty much it. That was sort of a surprise. And it was sort of the beginning of my interest in this kind of work. Actually, I've been digging up some of the things that I did during that period. And I wanted to sort of show you some pre-NFT digital art because I thought that might be kind of interesting. So
Absolutely, yeah. I'll pull it up right now on the screen.
let's see. Start from the beginning. So basically, I first want to show you hold on a second. Let's do that again. The algorithm that I was talking about, basically one that looks for points of motion in a video. So here, I pointed the camera at a wave, and these are the points of motion turned white and fading in and out. And so this is the algorithm that I had sort of stumbled upon. And I thought was pretty interesting because it sort of became a connection between the real world when someone walks by a camera and what happens on a screen in this sort of ambient organic way. So that was sort of the starting point. And then let's see, I actually recently dug up a catalog from that period of time because I ended up showing various experiments that I had done in festivals in different places. And this is a festival in Japan. And I was interested to see that in the writing that I did, and this is a long time ago, I was sort of asking questions that I'm still asking, which are questions like, can a computer be a tool for aesthetic things, and in what way? And basically, can it be as good at creating beauty as it is in crunching numbers? So that's just a question I've wanted to answer for quite a long time. So anyway, I was showing this work in festivals, and I thought to myself, well, is there a way to put them in the world in a context where they would stick around for longer than a 3-day festival? So I contacted a number of different architects in New York and said, I want to show you something, and would go to their offices and set up my laptop and show them how, you could move in front of a camera and something on a screen can actually change in response to that. And I was lucky, people were very receptive, and I then got a number of commissions with their clients. And one of the clients was Chanel. And I got a number of different commissions for various stores around the world. And just wanted to talk about one of the pieces that I did for them, because I think it basically illustrates a process that I have been using ever since then. So recently, I'm very thankful to be part of a book group, and I read this book for a book group, and it's all about the process of writing. And it's this wonderful and hilarious writer named George Saunders going through different short stories and talking about, or Russian short stories like Chekhov, how these stories were constructed. And one of the interesting things I discovered is that the way this writer writes is not totally unlike my process, this sort of idea of intuition plus iteration. He basically says, I'll start with any sentence. It doesn't even matter what sentence, and I will take it from there and sort of figure things out as I go. And for me, that's kind of what I do. But it's not usually, of course, it's not a sentence. I usually start with a question. And so for this Chanel commission, I thought to myself, like, what if, what can I do with a thread? I was thinking about the Chanel designs and the very traditional Chanel design of tweed. And what could I do with a line, a simple line? And how could that on a screen be impacted by somebody walking by it? So that question led me to do a bunch of different experiments. And so I would call them swatches. So this one is, it's a bunch of lines and they kind of move almost like grass. So that's one thing we could do. And then I thought, well, or I could make it more of a loom. And in this sense, this loom would be moving, and then as someone walks by the video, the lines would disperse. So this sort of conversation between order and disorder. So this is the final piece installed in the store. So this is a store in Beverly Hills, a Chanel store, and you can see there are stairs, and in front of the stairs, you can see sort of washed out a very large screen. You'll see coming up, yeah, that's the piece. And basically, when someone walks down the stairs, you see them walking, the threads dispersed. And when no one was walking on the stairs, the threads would come back. Oh, there are a lot of people on the stairs there. Chaos on the stairs. Anyway, documenting work from that time was a little bit challenging. It's so nice that now, you can do digital art and it sits on the blockchain. So anyway, so that is sort of a taste of the work I was doing before NFTs.
Very cool. And what was your introduction, into the space of, NFT crypto space for you?
So that's a good question. Like many digital artists from this era, I also pursued other work. Some digital artists went into academia, some went and worked for corporate, and others worked for startups. And I took the startup route, and that sent me to business school and then working on various startups. And I found myself at a DeFi crypto startup, which I found pretty interesting. So yeah, that was my introduction to crypto through this startup. And then that was in 2017. And at the end of that period, I actually saw some crypto art, very, very early crypto art. And I thought it was pretty interesting, but it was a little bit more, it was even more alt than the digital art that I'd been doing. And I thought, oh my gosh, maybe I should, I don't know. Anyway, before I knew it, it became something very interesting to me. So there you have it.
Very cool. And did it immediately make sense? It sounds like, so you've had, I think it was 2017, you mentioned you were kind of like in DeFi crypto at that point. But when you started learning about NFTs, did it make sense to you? And did you immediately think that like, hey, like I want to do something and participate in this space?
Oh, yes. I've been going to fine art festivals for years, walking around galleries, looking for digital work to be sold. And, understandably, I think gallerists were always afraid of it because 1, technically it's so hard. 2, it was quite ephemeral. 3, there are always problems, like the screen didn't work or the projection didn't work or whatever. And so seeing that this kind of art is suddenly even more sort of permanent and more liquid, and there's a real market for it. I never would have predicted it, and it's pretty exciting.
Very cool. Well, this is probably a great time to transition to talking about your project, Symbol One on Art Blocks. Just came out the other month. Yeah, I would love to kind of just dig in and start from the top, and maybe you can start it off by telling us, about the inspiration and process for creating Symbol One.
That's good. Should I tell you a little bit about the NFT work I did right before that, or should
I? Yeah, we can definitely do that.
Okay, so I put together some of the images from that. Maybe I'll share screen again.
Great. Yep, I see it right there.
So that point when I saw that crypto and art and so many things I was interested in were converging was during the pandemic. And we were in a small cabin in Maine, and we were going for lots of walks through the woods, as we would, with a lot of time on our hands and no other people to hang out with, and lots of trees. And I would take these video snippets of our walks, and one question, again, most of the time when I have an idea I'm pursuing, it starts with a question, was, could I take these snippets of video and compress them into one image, kind of like a pressed flower, but in video form? Mm-hmm. And so that's what I did. This was winter. I think I got spring, summer, fall. So these were actually the first NFTs I minted, and I was lucky to get an invite to Foundation, and I minted a couple of them on Foundation, which was kind of exciting. And from there, I decided I wanted to meet other people, here in this cabin, just us. I wanted to reach out and connect with other people in this space. So I went and did a Ethereum hackathon online and met these guys in Berlin, which is pretty fun. And we collaborated on a project during the hackathon. And basically we were addressing this question, again, starting with a question, like, what if you take an NFT that already exists, you take its features and you create a new NFT, almost as if it's like a genetic code and you're creating another entity. And so that led to this platform, generative platform called Splice. And we actually were finalists in the hackathon and, pursued building this, which was pretty fun. One of the nice things about it is it allowed me to get to know a bunch of generative artists who we invited onto the platform to create these algorithms that would feed off other NFTs. We started with taking the palette of an NFT and then applying that to a new NFT. And this was the idea. I wrote an algorithm for it, and I was sort of assigned the task to do something figurative, which is not usually what I do. But I started with a question again, and that is, what if we had a skyline of a city, and that the curvature of that skyline followed the path of Ethereum prices over the course of a year? So, this is an example. Somebody would take, their PFP, and the palette of that would be extracted. And basically the curvature of the buildings, if you see it going up and down, I forget what year this was. Maybe it was 2019. I don't know. But the curvature is Ethereum prices, as if it's sort of this urban environment built on Ethereum. This is another one, the palette extracted. So that was
I love that.
The general idea. But all along, I was eyeing art blocks and thinking, look at that. There's so much incredible work on art blocks. That seems so much fun. And so I started working on a project. And once again, starting with a question, I was taking, my morning run, and I was thinking about a conversation that I had been witnessing in the generative art space. And that was about making marks on a digital canvas, and whether that mark should have the hand of the artist, whether it should look like paint, whether it should look like something that was digital, like where does that go? What is this conversation? And I like both, actually. I like work that looks like it could have been hand painted. I like work that looks like it never could have been. But I was thinking, what would be an interesting way to play with these ideas? And I thought, well, what if I actually drew with the text of the algorithm itself? Like, what would that be? Little did I know that for engineering students, there's a very typical assignment called a quine. And I am not traditionally trained in engineering, but apparently a quine is an algorithm that only spits out the text of the algorithm itself. So little did I know that there is something like this that has existed in the curriculum. Anyway, I after my run, I went home and I started experimenting with this idea. And the first thing I always do, and excuse the scrawl, my handwriting, I mean, it's just degraded. I don't know. I don't.
No, not at all. This is great.
Basically, what I do is I always have a to try list. After I have this question and this starting point, I start making lists of things to try. And the first thing I started trying were these very, very sort of computery illustrations and strokes using code. So as you can see over on the right, it's a for loop repeated over and over again. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Where can I go from here? So then I thought, well, what if I take one of these brush strokes and I add some randomness? And that's when I went from the left side to the right side, which looked a little bit more organic. Again, still only using snippets of the code itself. And then this popped up. And again, oftentimes on these journeys, I just see something and I'm like, that's interesting. And that sort of takes me in a direction. So this was the first thing that I thought, oh, that's almost like a space. And again, it's all text and it's all code, but it's code that becomes this sort of something, it's sort of transformed into something kind of different. So anyway, then I started thinking, okay, I could have a set of brushes, all code, but sort of code that is laid out like a brush stroke. And what could I do to combine these? And I thought, okay, let's create some other parameters. What if I'm only using RGB and I'm using these brush strokes and I am creating these sort of ethereal images? Anyway, I liked this, but I thought, maybe keep experimenting. Along the way, lots of errors. This was my favorite error. It's sort of cascading nons. Nons stands for not a number. And you get that when things go awry. And I was like, I like that. I like that error. So I thought, okay, more colors, more swirling lines, not just rectilinear lines and strokes. But again, only using code. So every mark on the canvas is snippets of the algorithm itself. So then it was like, okay, what if these strokes got thicker? What if they got more opaque? And again, each step is like, oh, what am I going to try? What am I going to try next? So then eventually I came to a combination of these things, a combination of these sort of light gauzy strokes and more sort of thicker strokes. And I wanted this piece to be sort of almost like a love letter to digital art and generative art. So again, every mark on the canvas is made by text of the algorithm itself. So you have, these strokes are made of for loops that are repeating over and over as they would in a program. In every iteration, there's a snippet of the random function that sort of swerves in and out. And then at the bottom, you see the hash code. So it's almost trying to deconstruct and illustrate generative art. So I kind of like these layouts are sort of like meteors and bursts. And as you can see, if you look up close, what is a brush stroke becomes apparently the code. And the parts of the image that are solid looking are actually dense code. Again, it's all text. So, I worked with various different layouts. I've got, it's almost I see it almost like a narrative of logic and code sort of exploding into the world and kind of crashing down to earth and becoming these sorts of, sometimes these huge waves, sometimes you see the sort of meteor, sometimes it sort of blossoms out into many different elements. And sometimes it's just, it almost feels a little bit newspapery. But again, I love how in certain parts of the image you see real, it becomes solid, the logic disappears, and in other parts it becomes more and more apparent. And especially as you zoom into it, it's sort of, I feel like in a way it kind of captures our current way of living where code is everywhere, you know, often hidden, but always among us. So anyway.
I love it. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's really cool. When I first saw the project, I had no idea that, you know, the actual visuals itself were parts of the code. I was kind of just looking at it from far away, and then someone told me about it, and I really like just kind of zoomed in, and it was really cool to kind of just read all the snippets of code and just realizing that this is forming the actual art itself. So I really commend you on just kind of like that idea and then like putting it there, because I think it makes people think a little bit. Like, I'm not a coder myself, but to kind of understand that, like, hey, these are actual lines that you used, you know, to kind of create that visual. So I really enjoy this project. I'm curious to know, like, were there any, you know, big challenges, you know, while coding this project, or kind of going through the different iterations in this process?
Oh yeah. I mean, challenges, it wouldn't be an adventure without challenges, right?
Absolutely.
It's always a story when things go wrong in life. The stories don't come from things going right. So yeah, I mean, challenges at every step, especially dealing with floats. So a float is a decimal point. An integer is a whole number, and a float is a number with a decimal point. And working with decimal points when it comes to scaling up and down and having things work out, very challenging. I can say it's a little bit like the first time you do anything this long form is technically, it was an interesting adventure for me. And I can say the second time around is going to be like, ooh, I learned so much.
I love that. Yeah. And so the project name, Symbol One, I was reading your project description. It looks like it represents a chapter in one of George Bool's books called The Mathematical Analysis of Logic in 1847. And what was it about George Bool's and that specifically that book that kind of influenced you with the decision of that title?
Well, for me, you know, my introduction to coding was actually through a mathematical logic class that I took in college. I was a philosophy major, and I really loved it was one of the core classes that I had to take. But I was so thankful because I just loved the puzzle solving of a mathematical logic class. Actually, the textbook that we used for this class was by a logician named Quine. And as I said, a quine it's strangely circular for me. So this piece was really about this world of logic. And I was looking at the work of various logicians, and I loved the idea of Symbol One, which is this concept of a term that encompasses all things, all categories of things, like real and imaginary. And again, this piece is really about the universality of logic in our lives. So it seemed fitting.
I love it. And how do you envision collectors kind of displaying this art from the collection? Obviously we're in the kind of this digital age, and then there's all these questions about people, especially it's up to the artist, you know, how they kind of envision their art, but some people prefer it digitally, maybe on digital screens, or, you know, via prints. For this specific project, how would you like collectors to display the art?
You know, I thought I would like it better in print, but actually recently, one of the Symbol One iterations was part of a show down at the Pier in downtown New York. And it was on a screen. And, you know, actually, I quite like it on a screen too. So I'm going to say both. Yeah, I think I quite like it in both contexts. And actually, again, it's sort of having it in both illustrates this idea of code, this universality of code on paper, in the world, on screens, everywhere we look.
Great. And, you know, to kind of wrap things up with Symbol One, do you have any personal favorites so far of the mints that kind of came through the minter?
I quite love those really wide frame ones when logic has sort of hit the ground and sort of exploded. I quite love these. I like the other ones too. You know, I like the other ones because they sort of have an intimacy to them, but these almost look landscape-like to me, or, you know, oceanscape-like, in a way that kind of makes me feel what I feel is happening in the world to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And, you know, to kind of move on past Symbol 1, do you have any plans to release any additional work later this year?
Well, you know, I have other questions that I am pursuing at the moment. As I said, I like to start with a question, and the journey sort of takes me places. So, you know, one question that I started kind of looking at before is sort of these images of motherhood. It's sort of an iconic theme throughout art history. And I started playing with this idea. And, you know, for me, contemporary motherhood is sort of like motherboards. You see there are little baby mothers inside the mothers. Anyway, I'm kind of interested in taking this journey. This is one of my journeys at the moment. Another journey is playing with data. You know, I really liked playing with the Ethereum prices as sort of the curvature of a cityscape. And but I've played with other data as well. And I'm kind of thinking, like, how is data art, and how does art become data? You know, I've been playing with EKG data and how that can create sort of this architectural space. And population data, you'd be surprised what countries in the world are growing population-wise more than other countries. You know, anyway, Ethereum prices, Bitcoin prices, weekly Bitcoin prices, and just seeing how data can become art, and what the fine line is between the two. And I love doing that. It plays on all these things I'm interested in. So yeah, I think these are two paths that I'm pursuing at the moment. We'll see where they take me. Again, these adventures, you never know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the fact that you start out with like a question, and then you kind of think about that, you know, as you kind of go about your journey through this, you know, creating art. How do you come up with the questions? Is it something that, you know, you have the lens where you kind of question everything, like your surroundings around you, or is it more of just, it kind of happens naturally and you just want to explore, think about that question, and the answer is, you know, a little bit more in depth?
You know, I think it's really, for me, it's just things I'm curious about. You know, I'm curious about what motherhood looks like now versus what motherhood looks like traditionally. I'm curious about data and how data is part of our world, but how sometimes when I look at a chart, it looks like, again, it looks like a landscape, or it looks like art. So it's really like, oh, I'm kind of, the thing that sort of motivates me most is probably being curious about various things.
Great. I love that. And I know you have it up right here. I would love to hear, you know, some of your recommendations, you know, for artists and collectors, to kind of learn more about generative art, or just anything that you recommend.
So yes, I have come across some books and such different media that I quite love, that sort of inform the way I think about art. And this is one of them. It's by an author. It's by a Norwegian author who wrote an epic series called My Struggle. And actually, you might be interested in some of these because it really talks about early fatherhood. And I mean, they're really, luckily I read things on my phone, so I don't have to carry around a book like this. But anyway, this author, he's a fantastic writer. And what I came to know recently is that he loves art. And he wrote this book about Munch. And Munch is the artist of the Scream. And in the book, he writes a lot.
I'll have to check that out. Yeah, I haven't heard that one before.
Yeah, it's really particularly interesting because he talks about originality in art and how you can't really extract it from the time and place where it's created. As original as an artist might be, it's attached to this, you know, this zeitgeist, which, you know, is pretty interesting to me. I love art that I feel sort of captures a moment. And this is another book that I quite enjoyed. It's a dialogue between David Hockney and an art critic, and they cover various topics. One of them is about making a stroke, a mark on a canvas, and how Hockney, who's a painter, a mark is interesting to him when he can see the speed that it was created and, you know, the hand that created it, basically. And it's just interesting to think about that in the context of where we are now in digital art, where there isn't necessarily a hand. Like, you can make it look like there was a hand, or you can make it look like there wasn't a hand. And can you make it interesting without the hand? Anyway, it brings up some, again, questions that make you curious, I think. The New York Times has these wonderful pieces called close reads, where they take a particular painting and they dive deep into it, and they basically zoom into pieces of the painting and talk about details of it. And it's just a wonderful way to learn about looking at art. And then, you know, I'm sort of a junkie for how things were made, as you can tell by what I talked about today. But not just in visual art, but this is the same sort of thing, but about music. On the left is this podcast about composers of the past and telling the stories of them. And on the right, another New York Times, they do some really good stuff. New York Times media called Diary of a Song, where they take a song and they interview the artist and talk about how it was made. I quite love it. And then finally, for collectors, I think these are two incredible movies about collectors of contemporary art. And what you see is that there's a lot of similarity between what was happening, you know, right before the World War II, when Peggy Guggenheim was collecting, and right after, when this couple, Herb and Dorothy, were collecting. Herb and Dorothy, it's an amazing story. Herb was a postal worker and basically spent his entire salary on contemporary art in New York. Wow. And he and his wife collected this had this amazing collection that they then, you know, donated to a museum, and then, you know, kept collecting afterwards. They had a tiny apartment full of art. And then on the right is Peggy Guggenheim, who, you know, wasn't a postal worker, but had the funds and to start collecting right before the war, and was in Europe, and, you know, collected a phenomenal group of artist work. And of course, she was sort of she was sort of alienated from her family because no one thought it was worth anything. And then, you know, you can see in her museum in Venice that, you know, they had to think again, no doubt. So I think, again, what's happening in generative art right now is it so reflects what happened at this time. And so it's a really fun time to collect, and it's really such a fun time to make this kind of work.
Absolutely. Well, I'm super excited to, you know, learn a little bit more about these movies and check them out myself. I don't think I've ever heard anyone talk about, you know, movies for collectors. And I think just based on your description, it sounds like these are two movies I have to check out. So I'm super excited to put this on the queue of movies for me to see and dive into this. So I appreciate those recommendations.
Great.
And to kind of close things out, how can people reach you should they have any questions or maybe learn a little bit more about your work?
Well, I'm very available on Twitter. So that is probably the best place to reach me. And you can look on my site that's on my Twitter profile for more of the kind of installation work that I did in various places. But anyway, yeah, Twitter is the best place to reach me. And I love meeting new people. So
excellent. Well, Emily, I really, really appreciate you being on After Dinnerments today. It's been fantastic kind of learning about your background, learning more about Symbol One, also just those fantastic recommendations, which I will include in the show notes of the YouTube and of the podcast. So thank you for those. I really appreciate that.
Great. So nice to be here, and thank you.
Absolutely. And just a couple news and notes for people. All of our After Dinnerments discussions are available as a podcast. Make sure to check us out on Spotify, Apple, Google, and Amazon. Finally, we have an Artblocks newsletter that gets delivered once a week with information on upcoming releases and generative art related news. You can find a link to the newsletter in the description of this video. I want to thank Emily again for joining me on After Dinnerments. Make sure you comment, like, and subscribe to the Artblocks YouTube channel. Be kind to each other. Buy what you love, and we will see you all next week. Thanks so much, Emily.
Thanks so much.